Welcome back to the class video for Module 6, in which we're looking at John Dickinson's Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer. In the first part of the class, we looked at the historical context in which Dickinson is writing. These letters appear in the final months of 1767, stretching into basically through the first half of 1768, and Dickinson is responding immediately to the passage of the Townshend duties within the broader context of Parliament's attempts to restructure the empire in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War. There are 12 letters in total, and in the assigned reading package I've given you both the first and the last, and a representative sample, a few in the middle. The way to approach this body of letters that I've given you is to see in the first letter the basic conceptual blueprint of the empire as Dickinson imagines it, to see in the middle essays his struggle to define exactly what Parliament has done and why it is unconstitutional or tyrannical, and then to see in the final letter what happens as a result rhetorically, the turn that Dickinson makes because he is so frustrated in trying to identify exactly what about Parliament's actions violate the principles of the British Constitution. In that final turn in the 12th letter, then, is the transition or the segue into a much more radical revolutionary rhetoric that we'll see from Thomas Paine in Common Sense in the next module, Module 7. So let's start with the first letter. And it's worth noting the kind of rhetorical posture which is so common among the British North American writers, these colonial revolutionary writers, this rhetorical posture of a kind of middling prosperity and objective detached philosophical neutrality. Dickinson describes these as the letters from, he describes himself as a farmer in these letters in the first paragraph. He writes, "I'm a farmer, settled after a variety of fortune near the banks of the river Delaware in the province of Pennsylvania." And down another couple lines, "My farm is small, my servants are few and good, I have a little money at interest, I wish for no more. My employment in my own affairs is easy, and with a contented, grateful mind, undisturbed by worldly hopes or fears relating to myself, I am contemplating the number of days allotted to me by my divine goodness." So Dickinson would like us to think that he is neither poor nor rich. He is not self-interested chasing money. If you took foundations of the American experience and read Plato's Republic, you may recall the opening scene with Socrates and his kind of gang of followers, and they meet the contented old man Cephalus. And Socrates asks Cephalus, "What's the key to your happiness and contentment in your old age?" And Cephalus replies, "I'm neither rich nor I'm neither poor, so I'm not obsessed with gaining money and exploiting other people to become rich, but neither am I so poor that I have to steal or worry from day to day about my existence. Because I've been content with a middling fortune, then I can be easy in my mind and reflect philosophically about what's truly the best thing for my community." There's a kind of objective philosophical detachment that comes with the rhetorical posture of being from the middling sort. And of course, being a farmer is a noble and virtuous and wonderful thing because you're close to nature and all the other tropes of American natural writing. This is all wonderful, except for John Dickinson, it's a bit of a fake posture. John Dickinson is, in fact, one of the richest people in late colonial Pennsylvania. He's a major presence in the Pennsylvania Colonial Assembly and the Governor's Council, and we'll talk more about those institutions in a couple of weeks when we get to Module 8. Dickinson is indeed so powerful within Pennsylvania politics that he is almost single-handedly responsible for the county of Delaware, which had been a county in the colony of Pennsylvania, being empowered to separate as its own state during the Revolutionary period and become the state of Delaware. Dickinson and his family are almost single-handedly responsible for the and in fact run Delaware as a kind of family machine politics for generations after the Revolution into the Jacksonian period. So Dickinson is a very rich and powerful merchant. He is indeed, I'm sure, not exaggerating that his landed estate is small. That's because all of his money is in stock and investments in shipping colonial goods and imperial goods into the colonies. Nevertheless, we can see the philosophical pose that he would like his readers to perceive him in, right? Of this middling sort who's detached, a person, a writer who's close to nature and close to his community, not obsessed with his own self-interest, not obsessed with power or making money, etc. Now, at the bottom of that first column, he identifies for us what has the immediate cause that has prompted him to write. He writes at the bottom of the left-hand column, "With a good deal of surprise I have observed that little notice has been taken of an act of Parliament as injurious in its principle to the liberties of these colonies as the Stamp Act was." I mean, the act for suspending the legislation of New York. Dickinson's use of legislation here is a little bit tricky. He really means the legislature of New York, or formally he means the power of legislation of New York. So in effect, he's drawing his readers' attention to an act of Parliament suspending the legislature of the colonial New York Assembly. Now, why did Parliament do that? Next paragraph. "The assembly of that government," meaning the government of New York, "complied with a former act of Parliament requiring certain provisions to be made for the troops in America in every particular, I think, except the articles of salt, pepper, and vinegar." Right? So the colonial legislature refused to fully comply with a demand by Parliament that they provide food for the troops. They did provide a number of articles, but they refused to comply with the demand for salt, pepper, and vinegar. So in response to that, Parliament suspended the colonial legislature. Now, he doesn't quite make clear why would the New York legislature refuse to provide salt, pepper, and vinegar. We'll find out in the next letter. The broader context here are the Townshend duties. So the colonial legislature of New York is protesting the Townshend duties by providing most of the provisions that Parliament is demanding for the British troops, but not all. And so they boycott or veto these three items as an act of protest. Now, why would they do that, or why would the other colonial legislatures comply? Skip down to the bottom of that column, the last paragraph on the right-hand column of page 2. An act of Parliament commanding us to do a certain thing, if it has any validity, is a tax upon us for the expense that accrues in complying with it. And for this reason, I believe, every colony on this continent that chose to give a mark of their respect for Great Britain in complying with the act relating to the troops cautiously avoided mention of that act, lest their conduct should be attributed to its supposed obligation. So that's a complicated, kind of deep in the weeds explanation of what's going on here. The colonial legislatures, because they do not want to recognize the power of Parliament to command them to do things like provide food for the troops, whenever Parliament passes a law that says the colonies must give over so many pounds of wheat and oats and potatoes and whatnot to the troops, the colonies pass their own laws that say, we, the colony of Massachusetts, hereby authorize so many potatoes to go to the British troops, but they refuse to acknowledge that they're doing it out of compulsion, out of obedience to Parliament's command. They just do it autonomously themselves, which sounds silly, but it is the constitutional game that the colonies play with the British Imperial Center during this whole period that the Acts of Trade or the Navigation Acts are in control. The constitutional principle is here again in the middle paragraph on the right-hand column of page 2. This is the constitutional principle that Dickinson is insisting on. He writes, if the British Parliament has legal authority to issue an order that we shall furnish a single article for the troops here and to compel obedience to that order, they have the same right to issue an order for us to supply those troops with arms, clothes, and every necessary, and to compel obedience to that order also, in short, to lay any burdens they please upon us. What is this but taxing us at a certain sum and leaving us only the manner of raising it? If they can do this one thing, if they can require us to provide a bushel of salt to the British troops, if they have the power to command us to do that, they can command us to do anything. So at the root of this power of taxation is the issue of sovereignty. Who is sovereign? The colonial legislature or the British Parliament? It is the highest power, taxation, which subsumes underneath it every necessary lesser power of government. In this construction, right, in Dickinson's conceptualization of how the constitutional order of the empire should work. And he gives us more clues to what the major components of this constitutional system are in the next page. So if we look on the left-hand column of page 3 in the first body paragraph, right, the principle that colonial legislatures are the sole authority to tax colonial residents in the highlighted passage. In fact, if the people of New York cannot be legally taxed but by their own representatives, they cannot be legally deprived of the privilege of legislation only for insisting on the exclusive privilege of taxation. If they may be legally deprived in such a case of the privilege of legislation, why may they not, with equal reason, be deprived of every other privilege? Now, that whole assertion depends on the conditional clause at the outset of it. If the people of New York cannot be legally taxed but by their own representatives. That is the constitutional principle that Dickinson thinks is enshrined in the Glorious Revolution of 1688. That was the victory, the constitutional order that had been created when Parliament triumphed over the king. The principle that was enshrined was the people cannot be legally taxed but by their own representatives. Now that makes sense if you want to extrapolate the experience within Great Britain, that should be replicated in every new governmental kind of realm or tier that's created with the empire. If you reside in Parliament, or if you're looking at it from Parliament's perspective, what 1688 enshrined was the power of Parliament to impose taxes on all Britons, and the residents of the colonies are Britons, therefore they are subject to Parliament's authority. In other words, they would not recognize that 1688 gets replicated at the colonial level. 1688 enshrined sovereignty at the peak of the empire. And there is one more component to that is the role of the king, creating a triad between colonial legislature, Parliament as the British legislature, and then this third thing, the role of the king. In the next paragraph, the highlighted passage, Dickinson claims, the Crown might have restrained the governor of New York even from calling the assembly together by its prerogative in the royal governments. So we want to hang on to that word prerogative. That's going to come up again and again through the remainder of the course. The royal prerogative here is the foundation of executive powers, especially the executive veto, by the time we get to the federal constitution, and we'll see commentary on this thing, the royal prerogative, the crown's prerogative, or what will become the executive's prerogative. So let's pause here in the text and try to get a kind of image in our mind of these different parts of the British constitutional order as Dickinson would have us understand them. So you see here an illustration of the components that Dickinson is trying to visualize. If you imagine kind of the center of the screen is the Atlantic Ocean, and in the lower left you've got the British North American colonies, in the upper right the British Isles. The Dickinson's construction of the constitutional order of the empire is that the British Isles have this classic Aristotelian trilogy. They have a one, a few, and a many, right? They have the king, the lords, and the commons, and that's what makes that constitutional structure valid and legitimate for the British Isles. And the colonies replicate that same model within each colony. So each colony has a version of the one, the few, and the many, which makes that constitutional order appropriate, valid, legitimate for the residents of that colony. Now, the obvious question is, well, then what holds this together as an empire? Why does Massachusetts need Great Britain? In what sense is it a colony subordinate to Great Britain? And that's the role of the king's prerogative. So the king gets to appoint the colonial governors. The colonial governors form a kind of, or perform a kind of executive function within the colonial governments. That is, the governor's approval is necessary for legislation to go into effect. The king can simply instruct the governor to refuse to approve the law, and that is, in Dickinson's construction, the constitutional order. That's the mode in which Massachusetts or New York or Pennsylvania is appropriately subjugated to British authority. It's through the role of the king in getting to appoint governors. And we'll come back to this basic model when, in a couple of weeks in Module 8, when we look at the state constitutions that are written during the Revolutionary period. They are imagining, they are responding to this dynamic. Now, if you accept this basic construction, right, which, of course, to emphasize, the advocates of Parliament and most residents of Great Britain did not endorse this way of thinking about the empire. But from Dickinson's perspective, if you accept this dynamic, then only the colonial legislatures can play the same role within each colony that Parliament gets to play for Great Britain, right? So Parliament is the legal and legitimate authority to tax residents of Great Britain, and in exactly the same way, the New York legislature and the Pennsylvania legislature are the only legal and valid authorities that should get to be able to tax colonial residents. Yet Parliament is still unique in this system because we've got this big space between the land masses of these different political communities, right? So, okay, fine. Essentially, Parliament concedes the principle of internal taxation when they revoke the Stamp Act, or they declare the principle that they could have enforced it, but they concede the practical policy matter of it. So, what connects the space between Great Britain and the colonies? Well, that is the unique role of Parliament. Parliament gets to regulate imperial trade. So as soon as a good leaves the borders of New York, it's in this nether region between New York and any other colony in Great Britain. In that space, Parliament is the appropriate body to regulate that trade. So the remainder of Dickinson's essays are going to try to distinguish between where power applies itself. What's the practical effect of power? And if it ends up internal to any of these colonies, right, he's going to have to prove the intent of the legislature and its effect for each of these series of acts you see in the lower right-hand scan. The Provisions Act, the suspension of the New York legislature, the Townsend duties, the Stamp Act, the duties on colonial products, prohibitions on colonial manufacturers. We'll see him work his way through those acts of Parliament, those demonstrations of the power of Parliament, and he's going to try to answer these questions about legislative intent. Are they regulating trade or raising revenue? Are these external or internal? Are these voluntary or compulsory? And out of those questions, he's going to determine that Parliament has exceeded its authority. We care about this map both because it's the animating idea of Dickinson's argument. He kind of has this visual in his head as he's writing. It's also a first kind of rough draft of a federal model. When we get to the Federal Constitution of 1787, one of the central questions that the Madison and the framers have to resolve is, what is the relationship between the central government, the federal government, and the state governments? This is an initial kind of sketch of how those power relationships can work. We're going to end up with a very different model by the end of the course, but this is an introduction to that idea. So let's turn now again to the next letter and Dickinson's letters and see him try to answer these questions about the way legislation complies or doesn't comply with these principles you see illustrated on the screen. With this kind of rough blueprint of Dickinson's conception of the constitutional order of the British Empire in mind, we can now return to the text in letter 2, and we find Dickinson identifying the real cause of concern among the colonists, and also the problem with that cause and why he would have begun with the first example of Parliament suspending the New York legislature. In letter 2, Dickinson begins, "There is another late act of Parliament, which appears to me to be unconstitutional and is destructive to the liberty of these colonies, as that mentioned in my last letter, that is, the act for granting the duties on paper, glass, etc." Now, even though he doesn't name them as such, these are commonly called the Townshend duties because Robert Townshend is the Prime Minister of Parliament who is orchestrating the passage of these acts. Yet in the very next paragraph, Dickinson also explains why this is a much trickier example to try to get colonists to understand the abuse of parliamentary authority. He says in the second paragraph of letter 2, "The Parliament unquestionably possesses a legal authority to regulate the trade of Great Britain and all her colonies. Such an authority is essential to the relation between a mother country and her colonies, and necessary for the common good of all. He who considers these provinces as states distinct from the British Empire has very slender notions of justice or of their interests. We are but parts of a whole, and therefore there must exist a power somewhere to preside and preserve the connection in due order. This power is large in the Parliament, and we are as much dependent on Great Britain as a perfectly free people can be on another." Now, this paragraph is a great example of John Dickinson's moderation, his sort of middle-of-the-road position on the issues that will culminate in the American Revolution. We already noticed in the first letter that he is very unhappy with the New York legislature for not providing the salt and the other provisions that Parliament demanded. He thinks that they should have complied with Parliament's desires. And Dickinson is going to be indeed one of the delegates, the few delegates to the Continental Congress who will ultimately refuse to sign the Declaration of Independence after the vote to approve the Declaration of Independence. So Dickinson is himself very much a centrist, a moderate. He is no radical revolutionary, but he's also writing here in the first phase of the growing dispute, and we'll see the radicalization of the colonists' arguments next in the next module when we read Tom Paine. There's a kind of two-part timeline here, an intensification of colonists' oppositions. Fundamentally, Dickinson here is acknowledging the necessity of a sovereign, right? We are but parts of a whole, and therefore there must exist a power somewhere to preside and preserve the connection in due order. He is describing the principle of sovereignty, the highest source of authority from which every other kind of mode of authority or institution that exercises government authority in the state must necessarily derive its power to do so. So Dickinson is affirming the notion of sovereignty, and he's placing it in Parliament. In this paragraph, he explicitly rejects the idea that the colonists have sovereign authority unto themselves, right? He says they have very slender notions of justice who thinks that we are states distinct from the British Empire. Now, if Parliament is sovereign and the colonies are not, and the colonists have experienced over a century of the British Empire enforcing these acts of trade or the navigation acts, then you are left with the conclusion that Parliament unquestionably possesses a legal authority to regulate the trade of Great Britain and all her colonies. If the Townshend duties are pursuant to this sovereign authority to regulate the trade of the empire, then there can be no constitutional argument against Parliament's exercise of this authority. Why are not the Townshend duties consistent with the kinds of laws that Britain has passed and imposed on the colonies for well over 100 years? That's the fundamental problem with getting colonists kind of revved up and in an opposition resistance mode to the Townshend duties. And you can see then why he prefers to start start this series of essays with Parliament suspending the New York Colonial Assembly, because that seems like a much more outrageous exercise of authority. He believes that Dickinson believes that his readers will get mad when they find out that the New York legislature has been suspended, because the colonists assume that the right to be represented by their assemblies is their constitutional prerogative. So that seems a clear violation, whereas the Townshend duties are much more ambiguous. So the conceptual burden that Dickinson is carrying here, the goal that he's trying to meet, is to argue and prove that the Townshend duties are unlike all of those acts of trade or navigation acts over the previous century or more, and they represent a fundamentally different type of power being exercised. And the categories that Dickinson emphasizes are that it's not a regulation of trade, it is rather a tax or an attempt to raise revenue. And if he can prove that the Townshend duties are an attempt to raise revenue, then he can invoke that great principle of 1688, the Glorious Revolution, that only Parliament has the ability to approve taxes for the king. He can replicate that claim from 1688 in 1767 and say, therefore, only the colonial assemblies have the power to tax, replicating the principle of 1688. So that's the conceptual burden, or the argumentative rhetorical burden, that Dickinson is trying to satisfy in these essays. And you can see then why that famous slogan, "No taxation without representation," becomes a conceptual focal point of revolutionary rhetoric, and we'll see that embedded in the state constitutions that get written. So that's the conceptual problem that Dickinson is confronting. So if we look at the top of the right-hand column of 4, we see him start to make these distinctions, this distinction between a regulation of trade or a power invoked to raise revenue or impose taxes. He writes at the top of the right-hand column of 4, "I have looked over every statute relating to these colonies, from their first settlement to this time, and I find every one of them founded on this principle till the Stamp Act administration. All before are calculated to regulate trade and preserve or promote a mutually beneficial intercourse between the several constituent parts of the empire. And though many of them impose duties on trade, yet those duties were always imposed with design to restrain the commerce of one part that was injurious to another, and thus to promote the general welfare. The raising of a revenue thereby was never intended." Now this is a patently absurd claim. Right? It is just counterfactual to the whole 100-year history of the British Empire preceding this. It is impossible to imagine that from King Charles forward that the British government was collecting these taxes not thinking about the revenue that they were deriving from it. right? But the point that Dickinson is making in the sort of evidence, the textual evidence that he has, is they never wrote it into the statute before. So if you look down at the bottom of column 4, a few months after came the Stamp Act, which reciting this proceeds in the same strange mode of expression thus, and whereas it is just and necessary that provision be made for raising a further revenue within your majesty's dominions in America towards defraying the said expenses, we, your majesty's most dutiful and loyal subjects, the commons of Great Britain, etc., give and grant, etc., as before. So when Parliament passed the Stamp Act, they explicitly wrote into the preamble of the statute when they were voting on it, we are doing this because it's necessary to raise a revenue. And again, they repeat that same language at the beginning of the Townshend duties. Coming to the next paragraph, the last act, granting duties on paper, etc., that is the Townshend duties, carefully pursues these modern precedents. The preamble is, whereas it is expedient that a revenue should be raised in your majesty's dominion in America for making a more certain and adequate provision for defraying the charge of the administration of justice, the support of civil government in such provinces where it shall be found necessary, and towards further defraying the expenses of defending, protecting, and securing the said dominions, we, your majesty's most dutiful and loyal subjects, the commons of Great Britain, give and grant, etc., as before. And the summation. Here we may observe an authority expressly claimed and exerted to impose duties on these colonies, not for the regulation of trade, not for the preservation or promotion of a mutually beneficial intercourse between the parts of the empire, heretofore solely objects of parliamentary institutions, but for the single purpose of laying money upon us. So it is the innovation of Parliament having inserted these preambles to laws that they purport, might otherwise, I should say, be interpreted as regulations of trade, but because they claim in the preamble that they are specifically trying to raise a revenue, that's what violates the constitutional principle in Dickinson's mind. For more than 100 years preceding the Stamp Act, Parliament had been, and the King, had been content to raise a revenue from the colonies as an incidental outcome of their primary goal, which was to regulate trade and have a healthy trade system among all the parts of the empire. The radical change that Dickinson is objecting to is fundamentally doing the same thing, exercising the same governmental power, but for a different purpose or a different declared or explicit purpose. That is the act of tyranny. So you can see how slippery and ambiguous this is as an argument for tyranny. That is to say, it's the exact same governmental power. The objection is not to the power which the government is exercising. It's rather an objection to the purpose to which that power is being applied. And you may think back to John Locke in those final chapters of the Second Treatise, as he was defining those acts which constitute tyranny. If you remember in chapters 18 and 19, he sort of had two categories. So if you remember, there's the invasion from without, which can destroy society as well as government, and then there's this destruction from within, of which there are two types. And when he went through that first type, they were sort of black letter violations of specific action. So Parliament is supposed to meet on the second Tuesday of every November. The King interferes and prevents Parliament from meeting. That's clearly an act of tyranny. And he had a list of those sort of pro forma types of violations. But then he had that second category, if you remember, and it was a broader category about purpose or motive. Either the King does any of these specific kind of black letter violations, or if the King obeys his constitutional authority, but does it for reasons that are contrary to the common good. Remember, the common good was that catch-all threshold term that Locke used. There's a similar kind of thing going on here in Dickinson's attempts to dissect the exercise of the power versus the purpose for which the power is being exercised. Having set this out as his primary conceptual categories now for the remainder of the letters, Dickinson is going to have to deal with objections and obvious conceptual problems with the argument that he's presenting. And the first major problem that he has to confront with arguing that these Townsend duties are taxes is that the colonists are not compelled to pay them. That is to say, simply do not buy the goods that have the tax placed on them, and you can avoid the tax. And we'll come back to this, the non-importation or boycott associations, when we get to the historical context for Tom Paine. But that's the first objection that Dickinson wants to deal with here in the next paragraph. He says, it may be perhaps objected that Great Britain has a right to lay what duties she pleases upon her exports, and it makes no difference to us whether they are paid here or there. To this I answer, these colonies require many things for their use, which the laws of Great Britain prohibit them from getting anywhere but from her. Such are paper and glass. That we may legally be bound to pay any general duties on these commodities relative to the regulation of trade is granted, but we being obliged by her laws to take them from Great Britain, any special duties imposed on their exportation to us only, etc. So this is a little bit getting in the weeds, but the Acts of Trade, or the Navigation Acts, do prohibit the colonists from engaging in certain kinds of manufacturing, many kinds of manufacturing, in fact. So things like iron products, things made out of iron, hinges and clasps and saddles and gear bits for your horses and whatnot. The colonists were encouraged to mine iron ore. At the same time, they were prohibited from creating blacksmithy shops and producing these items. They were commanded by the laws to ship that ore to Great Britain, let Great Britain's blacksmithies turn them into products, ship them back to the colonists, and the colonists would have to purchase them. So Dickinson's argument here is, under those constraints, the duties on British goods that we're required to buy in order to survive amounts to a compulsory tax. On the highlighted passage on the right-hand column of 5. For as we are under a necessity of using the paper, we should have been under the necessity of paying the duties. Thus, in the present case, a like necessity will subject us, if this act continues in force, to the payment of the duties now imposed. Skip a paragraph. The makers of that act knew full well that the confusions that would arise from the disuse of writings would compel the colonies to use the stamped paper and therefore to pay the taxes imposed. So that's in reference to the Stamp Act requiring stamps on paper goods. Well, the same thing applies with these other manufactured goods identified by the Townsend duties on the right-hand column of 6 in the highlighted line. Great Britain has prohibited the manufacturing iron and steel in these colonies without any objection being made to her right of doing it. Right? We have conceded that point. The colonists have conceded to the prohibitions on our manufactures. Therefore, Dickinson is arguing, any tax laid on any of those goods that we are prohibited from producing amounts to a compulsory tax. That compulsion amounts to an absence of consent, right? So in the next paragraph, our great advocate, Mr. Pitt. So this is, Pitt is a member of Parliament who is a great defender of colonial interests in these debates. He says, our great advocate, Mr. Pitt, in his speeches on the debate concerning the repeal of the Stamp Act, acknowledged that Great Britain would restrain our manufacturers. His words are these: this kingdom, as the supreme governing and legislative power, has always bound the colonies by her regulations and restrictions in trade, in navigation, in manufactures, in everything except that of taking their money out of their pockets without their consent. Again, he says, we may bind their trade, confine their manufactures, and exercise every power whatever, except that of taking their money out of their pockets without their consent. So this passage succinctly summarizes the conceptual dilemma that Dickinson and the colonists face. Notice this contradiction. Their advocate, the person who is defending the colonists in Parliament, right? This is the person most sympathetic to the colonial view, acknowledges that Parliament can do absolutely anything it wants to the colonies except taxation, right? So in that enormous grant of sovereign authority resides the problem of, well, then why can't we put a tax on iron manufacturers who live in London and Glasgow and Edinburgh, who reside within Great Britain, and then require the colonists to pay to buy those products, hence pay the tax? Only if you accept the colonial argument that that is a compulsory purchase, that I cannot survive in the New World without nails and hinges and screws and the other products made out of iron and steel. Only if you accept that argument, which if you think about Locke's state of nature and you want to be restored to all your rights without any government interference, well, then you got to figure out how to live without iron, without nails and screws and hinges and things like that, right? If you want your natural rights, only if you accept that the necessity to purchase these goods to survive is a compulsory purchase can you argue your way to these Townshend duties amount to a tax and therefore violate the constitutional principles of the British Empire. That's how difficult the colonial argument is. So let's leave off here with the end of letter 2. We'll pick up with letter 3 in the next segment of the course. This video is getting a little bit long, but you see the conceptual problem. We'll see him get further entrenched with a couple of other failed solutions, then we'll see his way out of it in letter 12.